I am based now in Brooklyn, New York, and I'm a US columnist for The Guardian, and also a columnist for The Nation magazine, which is a left-wing magazine based in New York. I came into journalism some 13 years ago, more by luck than judgment, and since then I've was reporting a lot from South Africa and Southern Africa from the beginning, then around Europe, before coming and being based in Britain, and then going over to the States in 2003. Grew up in Stevenage, studied to be a translator, and then decided that I wanted to use my own words rather than someone else's, and then did a postgraduate in journalism. Now, it was while I was a student in the former Soviet Union, as part of my Russian course, that I was living with a family, and they had a little dog called Reddick, and every evening it was a mother and her child, and every evening they used to take the dog out, and it struck me after a little while that they took the dog out with alarming regularity at about 5 to 9, and then they would be out until 9:45. Now, Leningrad, as it was then, was named then, St. Petersburg now, is not the warmest place often at that time. And I wondered what that was about. And a couple of times, I'm not a great pet lover, so I would usually stay at home, but a couple of times I actually joined them. And in these times when I joined them, I would see all these other people out walking their dogs. And the second time I asked the woman I was staying with, Inga, what is this about? And she said, we call this dog hour, or in Russian, sobachi chas. And I said, what is that? She said, it's the time when the Soviet news is on, and we don't want to listen to the Soviet news, so they call it news hour, and we call it dog hour. And we go, and anyone with a dog goes and walks their dog. Now, you couldn't get much more power than the media had in the Soviet Union, even at that time, which was the dying days of Gorbachev. But what that illustrated was the degree to which it had lost influence. It had power but no influence. People had simply stopped believing it. And in a way, that's the theme of what I want to talk to you about today with the media and the war on terror, because I think there is a far more complicated relationship between the media, political culture in which it operates, and the dominant mythologies that sustain that culture than we would want to give it credit for, particularly progressives. And I've found in the last few years, particularly in the United States, there has been this peculiar contradiction where people on the one hand have said the media is owned by corporate entities and you can't trust them, and on the other hand have bemoaned the fact that the media has failed to cover the war on terror accurately, to cover the social movements, to support it well, and so on. And it always begs the question, well, if you're right about the first thing and the media is a corporate entity, then why would you expect the second thing? Where do you think this is coming from? And do you think that the media could have done this on its own? So I want to run through, first of all, some of those mythologies that sustain what the media can do. And a good example of that isn't to do with the war on terror, it's to do with Katrina. Because there were two phases when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. The first was the media reporting of pathology, looting, shooting, raping, that the whole world had gone to hell in a handbasket. And there was a market for that. That mythology, or that reporting, could survive because it played into a dominant mythology. And that mythology is that black people are, by their nature, pathological. But then came this other counter strand, which was the scenes of people waiting all this time, of bodies floating down Canal Street and so on. And that contradicted a different mythology, which was that we are the most powerful country in the world, and things like this don't happen here. Now, of course, that's nonsense. Walk around much of America and you can see third world conditions all over the place, within yards sometimes of overdevelopment and hyper wealth. But it ran contra to the dominant mythology, and therefore when the media started reporting on that, suddenly there was an eruption and people demanded action, and they demanded action because that's not the way they think about themselves. As long as they're reporting on the pathologies of black people, well, there was a place for that, but there was no place for an America that looked like Haiti with skyscrapers. So what were the dominant mythologies that existed on September the 10th? Well, Americans had a sense they lived in a land of unrelenting progress and boundless opportunity that had not only the right but the duty to police the world in its own image. And where those perceived responsibilities ran against international human rights and international law, the latter would usually lose out. When the former British Foreign Secretary, the late Robin Cook, told Secretary of State Madeleine Albright that he had problems with his lawyers over using force against Yugoslavia without Security Council approval, Albright told him to get new lawyers. America, before September 11th, had refused to comply with the Kyoto Treaty under Clinton as well as Bush, and was in serious arrears of the United Nations. In other words, it didn't really respect international institutions at all because it felt it didn't have to. Meanwhile, among the British political elite, they saw themselves as a conduit, always, between Europe and America. And at home, in 2001, disturbances involving Muslim youth and organised racists received the notion, was received with the notion that Britain was the metropole of civilised behaviour to which the unenlightened had only recently descended. We have norms of acceptability, said David Blunkett, and those who come into our home, for that is what it is, should accept those norms just as we would have to do if we went elsewhere. Now, this was clearly news to those who were descendants of the Irish famine, who knew about Amritsar or Kenya or anywhere else that had suffered the full and brutal force of British colonialism. The nature or the idea that wherever Britons went, and you wouldn't even have to go into the past, and you wouldn't even have to go to the developing world, you could just go to the coasts of Spain and see that wherever Britons went, they clearly don't integrate necessarily, and they don't accept the norms of the places where they are necessarily. But there was a myth there that could sustain that argument. When the campaign came against arranged marriages, it was as though this was something alien to British culture. There was clearly little awareness that the British ruling class, not to mention the plot lines in the canons of most English literature, were dependent on arranged marriages. Of the 6 British monarchs of the last century, 5 married foreigners, and most of those unions were arranged. But somehow, the notion of the arranged marriage became this startling thing to British culture. That's not an argument for arranged marriage, it's an argument for not divorcing what's going on now from what has gone on before, that this was not alien to us. And these were the delusions and the political realities sold from above, but I would argue also bought from below when the planes hit the World Trade Center. From the outset for the War on Terror, these mythologies could sustain 2 crucial aspects of the war. The first was that it would be a war of the strong against the weak. It's the more powerful nations that got to define what terrorism is and how it should be fought. Haiti, for example, would have been hard pushed to get together a coalition to bomb France for harbouring baby dog Duvalier. Not because their case against him or his hosts is weak, but because the odds of military success would be pretty negligible. And second, that it would be led by nations that have at least as distinguished a track record in perpetrating terrorism as in combating it. If Gerry Adams vowed to lead the campaign against terrorism, most in Britain would flash a bemused grin. And when America pledges the same, much of Central America, Southeast Asia, and parts of Africa split their sides. The essential characteristic of a nation is that all its individuals must have many things in common, wrote the 19th century French philosopher Ernest Renan, and they must have forgotten many things as well. And many things were forgotten. It was intriguing, to say the least, that the historical figure that emerged as the international favourite on both sides of the Atlantic following the World Trade Center bombings was Winston Churchill. On the night of September 11th, his biography was on the bedside table of the then New York mayor and now presidential candidate Rudolph Giuliani. His bust then went to sit on the Oval Office desk of George Bush. In May of 2002, his name topped a BBC poll of the 100 greatest Britons. And in October of 2002, the televised portrayal of his pre-war years, Gathering Storm, won 3 Emmys in the States. Now, depends what you think of Winston Churchill as to whether you think he deserves all of that, but the point is that in October 2002, we were well on our way. We now know the decision had already been taken. We were well on our way to war with Iraq. And one of the justifications for going to war with Iraq is that Saddam Hussein had gassed the Kurds. The only problem with that was that the first person to advocate the gassing of the Kurds was indeed Winston Churchill. As president of the Air Council in 1919, he wrote, "I do not understand the squeamishness about the use of gas. I am strongly in favour of using poisonous gas against uncivilized tribes." A few years later, mustard gas was indeed used against the Kurds. So such were the heroes, both popular and political, of the day on both sides of the Atlantic. There was a sense of entitlement to military force, to right this wrong, and a general state of amnesia about our relationship to past wrongs. The Nationalist not only does not disapprove of atrocities committed by his own side, not only does not disapprove of atrocities committed by his own side, George Orwell once wrote, but he has a remarkable capacity for not even hearing about them. The media didn't invent these realities or these mythologies. They indulged them, they reflected them, they certainly for their most part supported them on both sides of the Atlantic, but they didn't create them. So while there was official pressure to toe the line of the government of the day, there was also popular pressure not to break with the self-image that so many citizens of these countries held dear. In other words, these mythologies were sold, there was a market for them, and somebody had to buy them. And if enough people bought them, then they could have their price. So where the wars were concerned, this was particularly true of America. Whenever the Washington Post ran pieces critical of the administration, reporter Dana Priest recalls, "We got tons of hate mail and threats, calling our patriotism into question." Gradually, journalists began to muzzle themselves. "It's an obscene comparison," said Dan Rather, the former CBS News anchor. "But you know, there was a time in South Africa that people would put flaming tires around people's necks if they dissented. And in some ways, the fear is that you will be necklaced here. You will have a flaming tire of lack of patriotism put around your neck. And now it's that fear that keeps journalists from asking the toughest of the tough questions and to continue to bore in on the tough questions so often. And again, I'm humbled to say I do not accept myself from this criticism." Now, many complied willingly, further isolating those who were determined to ask more hard questions. Introducing Arundhati Roy to his show shortly after the attacks, the senior American news anchor of ABC's Nightline, Ted Koppel, said, "Some of you, many of you, are not going to like what you hear tonight. You don't have to listen. But if you do, you should know that dissent sometimes come in strange packages." That's how he introduced Arundhati Roy. Peter Beinart, the editor of the once liberal magazine The New Republic, said during the Afghanistan war, "This nation is now at war, and in such an environment, domestic political consent is immoral without a prior statement of national solidarity, a choosing of sides." And then there was this, which is my favorite, from Michael Walzer. He said, "I will not march to stop the war while Saddam is standing, for that would strengthen his tyranny at home." Walzer was co-editor of a magazine which said it welcomed the clash of strong opinions, and its name was Dissent. So there was a full-scale collapse, which, while it was particular to America in this moment, was not particular to America overall. If you look at the British reporting of Northern Ireland, or if you looked at the French reporting of Algeria, the Belgian reporting of Congo, you would find the same things. There seems to be an inverse relationship between the distance of a national media and its ability to report critically. In Britain, while in America the primary targets were foreign, in Britain they were domestic. The issue from the outset after the bombing of the World Trade Center was how to corral and cower a Muslim population who sought to express their democratic rights to oppose military interventions and the civil liberty curbs that were undoubtedly going to come. We moved into a revived version of the Tebbit test. In 1990, the issue was, which side are you on when Britain plays cricket? In 2001, as they set out to Afghanistan, it was which side of the B-52s are you on? The rights of Muslims to live in Britain became contingent. And there was a peculiar and nefarious poll, so-called, in the Sunday Times in November 2001 that claimed that 4 out of every 10 Muslims believed Osama bin Laden was right to mount a war against America. Now, this poll was not conducted by Murray or Gallup using established methods of questioning and weighting. It was carried out by the Sunday Times itself, which sent its reporters to interview people as they came out of mosques. It wasn't a poll, it was a huge vox pop. It had about as much validity as The Guardian sending its staff to stand outside Catholic churches on Sunday mornings and ask people what they think of the peace process or the monarchy, and then representing that as Catholic public opinion. But nonetheless, the findings of these polls, so-called, informed many an ill-informed opinion. So, if the media was intent on pitching these reactionary ideas and often baseless claims, then mainstream society was no less ready to catch them. Thanks to new technologies, however, the few that didn't found an expanding niche market. American audience figures for BBC World News leapt 28% in the first 6 weeks of the war, elevating its Baghdad correspondent Raghi Omar to the status of a sex symbol. Meanwhile, American visitors to the websites of the BBC and The Guardian rose exponentially since September 11. So there was a market for progressive views, but it was neither the largest nor the most powerful. And most in the run-up to the Iraq War, in particular, decided that when push came to shove, they were going to go with power rather than truth. The day after Colin Powell did his show and tell at the United Nations Security Council, and I was there to report on that, I remember, waiting like everybody else and thinking, well, it doesn't really seem as though he has that much. So I was shocked the next day to see the Washington Post columnist, the late Mary McGrory, write a column entitled, "I'm Persuaded." Describing how Vietnam came close to making her a pacifist, McGrory conceded that nobody I know was for the war, but that something about Powell's performance made her reconsider. I don't know how the UN felt about Colin Powell's J'accuse speech against Saddam Hussein. I can only say that he persuaded me, and I was as tough to convince as France. Well, thankfully, she wasn't as tough to convince as France. And 2.5 years later, Powell referred to that episode as a painful blot on his record. The power of both illusion and delusion in these moments should never be underestimated. The compulsion to believe in something that we need and want to be true rather than see reality for what it is can at times be astounding. A point in case was the eyewitness accounts of Brazilian student João Charles de Menezes before he was shot dead on the Underground. Now, not all of these accounts were made up by the police, although they did nothing to deny the ones that were. But listen to this from Mark Whitby, a plumber from Brixton. He said he saw a Pakistani terrorist being chased and gunned down by plainclothes policemen. Less than a month later, Mr. Whitby told the Daily Telegraph he now believes that what he actually saw was a surveillance officer being thrown out of the way as Mr. Menezes was being murdered. Anthony Larkin, who was on the train, said he saw this guy who appeared to have a bomb belt and wires coming out. Turned out that the Pakistani in a puffer jacket who vaulted the barriers was, in fact, a Brazilian in a light denim jacket who picked up a free paper and used his Oyster card. Now, I'm not talking here about people lying. The potency of downright fabrication is self-evident, but what is really insidious is the propensity of people to arrange an array of possibilities, probables, maybes and might-bes and construct them from them a reality that is definite and wrong. In a global poll conducted by the Washington-based Pew Research Center last spring, came a partial explanation for the gulf between this reality and perception. Most Americans who believe that their country is a benign exporter of democracy and freedom were surveyed, and it turned out that only 75% of them had heard reports of abuses in both Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq and at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. That's compared to 90% of Western countries and Japanese who had heard of them. So in other words, Americans were less likely to be aware of atrocities and human rights abuses inflicted by other Americans, allegedly committed in the interest of their own security, than people in other countries. No wonder then they would move in the way that they do and believe in the way they do if that's what they are determined to believe, regardless of what they see. Now, the thing with mythologies can only go so far. I think it's important because of the manner in which people talk about the media as though it stands free and abstracted from the broader society and the political culture. But the media was particularly culpable in two respects. First, and this is particularly in the case of America, although differently so in the case of Britain, they acted as stenographers for the powerful. John Burns, he was then the Times bureau chief in Baghdad, rebuked Judith Miller, a reporter, for writing an article about Ahmed Chalabi, the Iraqi National Congress leader and Bush administration advisor before the war, without informing him. Miller replied that she had been covering Chalabi for about 10 years and had done most of the stories about him for our paper. Chalabi, she added, has provided most of the front page exclusives on WMD to our paper. A study by the Defense Intelligence Agency some months afterwards found that most of the information provided by defectors connected to Chalabi was of little or no value. Meanwhile, weapons expert David Albright experienced the full thrust of the consequences of this when he appeared on television in the run-up to the war. I felt a lot of pressure, he said, from journalists to stick to the subject, which was Iraq's bad behavior. And that in turn reflected pressure from the administration. I always felt the administration was setting the agenda for what stories should be covered, and the news media bought into that rather than take a critical look at the administration's underlying reasons for war. Once on a cable news show, Albright said that he felt the inspection should continue, that the impasse over Iraq was not simply France's fault. And during the break, he recalls, the host got really mad and chastised him. The administration created a set of truths that put up a wall to keep people within it, Albright says. On the other side of the wall were people saying they didn't agree. The media were not aggressive enough in challenging this. But others were challenging it, which brings me to the second failure on both sides of the Atlantic, which is the refusal to give serious and comprehensive coverage to the anti-war movement. This was first and foremost a journalistic crime. Here was a large group of people, larger in the UK and the US, but nonetheless substantial, mobilizing public opinion in unprecedented numbers over the central news story of the day. In that period, such a movement required a beat reporter to be on it all the time. You don't have huge movements like that often, and when you do, if you have the resources, you put someone on it and find out what it's about. Not to cheer it on, but to cover it. Instead, the anti-war movement was at best ignored and at worst ridiculed. And this had serious political consequences, since those who were opposed to the war often felt isolated and impotent. It's rare when people seriously publicly engage. Leslie Kagan, the national coordinator of the largest anti-war organization in the US, told me earlier this year. They watch it on TV, they read about it in the newspapers, they get angry, but that doesn't necessarily mean they engage. So it's difficult to know the depth of feeling. But those who wanted to engage wouldn't have known how or where, or sometimes even have pursued many of the issues of why, because the notion that there was an anti-war movement out there, a group of people actively resisting the war on terror, not just the war in Iraq, was really airbrushed. It wasn't even like, people talk about rewriting history, but the ink was still dry on the first draft when they did this one. There were things that they simply wouldn't see or wouldn't deal with if they did see. And throughout this time, there was an electoral void that grew between popular opinion and a political class in both countries. Put bluntly, opposition to the war grew but found no electoral expression. In 2002, 2004 and 2005, the British and American electorates at different times voted in the very people who had made these increasingly unpopular wars the hallmark of their leaderships. It wasn't just incidental to who Bush or Blair was, it was central to what they deemed their record to be. And while the media played a role in this, for reasons cited above, it can't be held solely responsible. The question of why these social movements that grew up around the war failed to cohere sufficient legitimacy to confront those politicians politically has to be dealt with. What were the nodes of disconnect that failed to produce viable alternatives? How comes we, meaning us in the anti-war movement, won the argument but kept losing the votes? Such a dislocation between popular hostility to the war on terror, and particularly in Iraq, the war in Iraq, and the determination of the political class to persist, could only hold out for so long. We're all capable of believing things which we know to be untrue, wrote George Orwell in his essay In Front of Your Nose. But then, when we are finally proved wrong, impudently we twist the facts so as to show that we were right. Intellectually, it's possible to carry on this process for an indefinite time. The only check on it is that sooner or later, a false belief bumps up against solid reality, usually on a battlefield. And this is precisely what's happened in Iraq with American public opinion. American public opinion has primarily turned against the war in Iraq, not because Americans think it's wrong, but because they're losing. That is the primary thing that drives American views on Iraq. And if they can change the perception, and the media will be central to the change of that perception, if they can change the perception about how the American troops are doing and how the war effort is doing, then that support will actually will come back. So this moment produced a rupture between what Gramsci called common sense and good sense. Common sense being the prevailing attitudes of the time, and good sense being what is right and can be empirically proven. Mainstream commentators and aides who had been the primary practitioners of common sense had little option but to admit their gullibility as the sole refuge from their association with this calamity. In November 2005, Colin Powell's aide, Lawrence Wilkerson, or former aide, because Powell was out by then, told the Today programme in the UK, "You begin to speculate, you begin to wonder, was this intelligence spun? Was it politicised? Was it cherry-picked?" You would think, as Wilkinson was in the State Department, he would know. Did, in fact, the American people get fooled? I'm beginning to have my concerns. Well, go figure. One would have thought that the speculation would have started before the bombs dropped rather than after. But such confessions are worse than useless if they are not followed by some examination of why these people were so gullible and how they would avoid repeating the same mistakes. And the mistakes do keep coming. The high priest, I believe, of this common sense is New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman, who at various moments in a run-up to war called for France to be kicked off the Security Council and was a major so-called liberal supporter of the war. Now, Thomas Friedman has kept perpetuating the myth that we are just about to turn the corner, or America is just about to turn the corner in the war on terror and finally get it right. And this has given rise to the invention of what people call the Friedman Unit, because that corner always seems to be just 6 months away. In the space of 2.5 years, doesn't matter when he says it, it's always 6 months away. So in the space of 2.5 years, Friedman would utter his 6-month deadline no less than 14 times, everywhere from Oprah's couch to CNN. On November the 23rd, 2003, he wrote, "The next 6 months in Iraq, which will determine the prospects for democracy building there, are the most important 6 months in US foreign policy in a long, long time." October the 3rd, 2004, CBS's Face the Nation. "What we're going to find out in the next 6 months is whether we have liberated a country or uncorked a civil war. December the 20th, 2005, PBS's Charlie Rose. We're at the beginning of what I think will be the decisive 6 months in Iraq. Okay, because I feel like this election, I feel from the beginning Iraq was going to be ultimately what Iraq is made of it. These 6 months just keep coming. And what Friedman is relying on is a convenient sense of amnesia, that we won't remember what he said last time, just in the same way that the dominant mythologies rest on the idea that we'll forget the murders and the massacres and Churchill and so on. It demands us forgetting to make any sense. We are the sum of the things that we pretend to be, said Kurt Vonnegut, so we should be careful what we pretend to be. Well, in the media's coverage of the war on terror, most have not been careful enough. They pretended to be objective. They weren't. They pretended to be independent. They weren't. They pretended to be accurate. They weren't. They pretended to be balanced. They weren't. But when the news came on, most people did not go out and walk their dogs. They sat, they stopped, they listened, and enough of them believed to make it possible. The media did this by themselves, but they could never have achieved it alone. Their efforts were sustained by their respective political cultures, which were in turn underpinned by dominant national mythologies. The journalists in the media were supposed to talk truth to power, but instead they told lies about the powerless. Thank you.